In number 7 on the Lesson 7-1 intro problems, the first thing that I notice is we have a sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta. If you look at the Pythagorean identities, that's the primary Pythagorean identity, is that the sine squared plus the cosine squared is equal to 1. So that ugly numerator is equivalent to 1. I'm going to replace it with 1. So now we have 1 over the cosine. And based on the reciprocal identity, we can see that 1 over the cosine is equal to the cosine's reciprocal, the secant. So that fraction here reduces to the secant of theta. In both number 8 and number 9, I see 1 minus the sine squared, and I know that's 2 out of the 3 components of the primary Pythagorean identity. I have the sine squared and a 1 together. I want to see if perhaps that's somehow equal to the cosine squared, and I can see that if I subtracted the sine squared over to the other side of this identity, it would be written as the cosine squared equals 1 minus the sine squared. So I can replace 1 minus the sine squared with cosine squared. In number 9, we have 2 components of this Pythagorean identity. This version of the Pythagorean identity has a 1 and a secant squared in it. And I can see that if I rearranged this equation, if I subtracted the secant squared over here so that it was 1 minus the secant squared, I would then subtract the tangent squared to the other side, and I'd have 1 minus the secant squared is equal to negative tangent squared. So that's what I used. 1 minus the secant squared would be equivalent to the negative tangent squared. If I look down at 10, 11, and 12, these 3, again, all 3 of these are variations on a Pythagorean identity. The identity, this one here, tangent squared plus 1 equals secant squared. I can see that has 2 of the components of this identity, so if I rearrange this equation, this identity here, I can see if I did subtract the secant squared to the other side and subtract the 1 to the other side, this would be written as tangent squared minus secant squared equals negative 1. So I can replace this expression with negative 1. Secant squared minus tangent squared. Okay, take this identity again and rearrange it. If I subtract the tangent squared to the other side, it's equal to 1 on the left. So secant squared minus tangent squared is equal to positive 1. This should say a positive 1 right here. I don't know why I have a negative 1. For number 12, cosine squared and a 1, that's 2 components of this Pythagorean identity, and I can see if I did subtract the 1 to this side, I would have to subtract the sine squared to the other side. And so cosine squared minus 1 would equal the negative sine squared. So that's what I've replaced this expression with, is negative sine squared.